Big Shelf.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by ThatShelf.com. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we went, hey, that's where that Simpson joke comes from. Regardless, each week, we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me, as always, is the pumpkin to my honey bunny, my co-host, Nate Storing. How are you feeling today, buddy?
I'm good. I'm feeling like I'm basking in the golden glow of a mysterious briefcase.
Ooh, is it his soul? We don't know. We'll never know. He'll never tell. If it wasn't clear from that reference, or the fact that the title's in our, podcatcher, this week we watched Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction from 1994, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. You might remember it from such Simpsons episodes as Season 6's Bart's Girlfriend, which features a Dick Dale-style surf rock music cue only a month after this movie came out, Season 7's 22 short films about Springfield, Season 7's supercalifragilisticexpialidocious grunt Oshus, and possibly Season 12's A Tale of Two Springfields. And today is a very special day for us as Simpsons nerds because we got the chance to speak with legendary Simpsons writer and showrunner Bill Oakley about his favorite films, Quentin Tarantino's influence on pop culture and The Simpsons, and of course, steamed hams.
Yeah, this was kind of a dream come true, really. I mean, I wish I could tell our high school selves that this is going to happen in the future, because I don't think that our high school selves would have believed us.
No, we absolutely would. Well, first we'd be like, what's a podcast? And then we would be like, nah, yeah, it's crazy. This was such an honor, very exciting. It's kind of the reason we started the show, if I'm being perfectly honest, was to get to talk to people like this. So let's take a listen to that interview. Along with his writing partner, Josh Weinstein, he was the showrunner of The Simpsons during seasons 7 and 8. He's the co-creator of Mission Hill and The Mullets, and has worked on shows like Futurama, The Cleveland Show, Portlandia, and Disenchantment. He's a food influencer and founder of the Steamed Ham Society. It's Bill Oakley. Welcome, Bill, and thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Hey, I'm excited to be here, and thank you for plugging my food thing. That's all I care about these days. So let's just make sure that we emphasize that heavily and that everybody listening to this goes and joins the Steamed Hams Society as well. So I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite episodes.
Well, then I guess we should keep it focused on the food element, because this is a very food-heavy episode, if we're honest.
That's true.
We were always running into that. I mean, even when we were writing these scripts, man, it was like, we got 4 food jokes on this page. Not every joke can be about food, because especially when you're hungry, you want to make everything about food. And I think if you look at our seasons, you will see, especially in our scripts, you will see that Josh and I really were hungry a lot of the time.
Well, I know from listening to a lot of the commentaries over the years that you guys sort of talk a lot about how it was really just the writing process was writing enough to get to lunch and then determining what you were going to have for lunch.
Yeah.
So,
sure.
Just on the subject, what was your favorite lunch to order while you were writing? Was there like a go-to restaurant?
It depends on whether you're... Let me explain. At least set the scene for people who are younger. Okay, so we're talking about 1992, 93, 94, et cetera, et cetera. People didn't have cell phones back then. And there was nothing to distract yourself. It was kind of unkosher to read the newspaper in the room or whatever. So you had to sit there and work all day long. All day long. The only thing you could do for at least a couple years was smoke, which Swartzwelder did to an extreme in the room. And then they banned smoking in LA workplaces in 93. And then he never came in again. And that's what happened. But so, what happened, that people would distract themselves with food. And there was a room right next door to the writer's room that had like M&Ms and Oreos and all that kind of stuff and Coke. And people would just eat that. Somebody would bring it. People would always go into the room, open a huge bag of Doritos, eat 2 Doritos and bring the bag in and put it in the room. And then everybody else would eat the Doritos. And that is why when I left The Simpsons, I lost 65 pounds. And I'm not the only one. Mike Reiss, that happened to Mike Reiss too. So yes, the food became a focus of your life because it was the only distraction. So when we ordered lunch, we ordered lunch because it was too time consuming to go out to lunch. So they would bring in a lunch and it would be free and a PA would bring it. And so it would become a process like, where are we going to go for lunch? Well, okay, we went to this, we have a book of menus, and then you'd sit there and you'd pour through the menus. And then, you'd order an appetizer, you'd order an entree, and you'd order a dessert. One guy who shall remain nameless, at least some points ordered a whole pie and then ate a piece of it every hour throughout the afternoon.
Wow.
On occasion. And so, yeah, that became a big thing. And then also dinner. God forbid we had to stay for dinner. I can curse on this podcast, right?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can curse.
Many of us were just like, let's just go. I don't care if I have to eat dinner at home at 11 o'clock. I'd rather not take an hour and a half to order dinner and prolong our stay that much. But if we ordered dinner, man, it would be like, you would just go nuts. I would often order stuff to take home to my family. I'd order extra shrimp cocktails and stuff and put them in the fridge and take them home. So, yeah, not that food is not all a focus of our lives to some extent, but it became an unhealthy obsession during those years.
Yeah, I worked in TV prior to my current gig and can attest that that was sort of the one thing that kept us going on those long days was like, yeah, what are we going to get for lunch today? And we had the benefit of having like Uber Eats or Foodora or like and DoorDash, all that stuff, which you guys obviously wouldn't have had at that time. But there was a lot of time pulling up the app and everybody's scrolling and figuring out like, what are we having today? It usually ended in fish tacos because that just seemed like it was quasi healthy. And so you felt a little
whatever
bit
you got to tell
it.
yourself, man.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, that's where we had a lot of rotisserie chicken. I mean, Kookaroo was really big back in the day then, and everybody ordered so much rotisserie chicken, not only from Kookaroo but also from the commissary and things like that. And it was very common. The other thing about eating that I've discovered is that it often makes you sleepy. If you eat something with a lot of carbs or whatever, you're kind of knocked out for about 2 hours after you eat in the mid-afternoon. And that's bad if you're trying to get something done. If you're just a writer in the room, though, you're like, fuck it, I don't care if I'm in a daze for 2 hours. If you're the guy running the room, you're like, please, guys, don't have a piece of pie. That's what happened to me. And so once we became more in charge, and certainly at things like Futurama and our own show, I would be the person having the rotisserie chicken or having the small side salad or a half a tuna sandwich on whole grain bread and then putting it away and getting back to work because I didn't want to be all sleepy and I didn't want to make everybody have to stay there extra late because they were in a daze all afternoon.
Yeah, that was the thing our producer would always do is like they'd treat us with like booze, like they'd bring beer for lunch or whatever as a treat. And then you're like, wait a minute, I know what this means. This means I'm not going home until 11 o'clock. Right? Like it was, so it got to the point where you're like, no, I'm good. I'm sticking with water. I know your tactics. So yeah,
oh my God.
True. Well, I guess people probably best know you as a TV writer and showrunner. But since this is a, movie podcast for Simpson fans, I'd love to get to know you as like a movie fan. What are some of your favorite movies, some of your favorite directors?
I wouldn't say that I'm going to blow anybody's mind with unusual tastes. I'm a fan of movies that all guys my age like Apocalypse Now, Goodfellas, stuff like that, Animal House, etc. It's Brett Kavanaugh movies. Yeah, the movies he cited in his hearings. In general, I love movies by Quentin Tarantino. Again, that's not anything that unusual, and we're talking about something related to that today. In terms of like weird movie, I'd probably say that my favorite movie of all time, and nobody would ever, I think Josh might concur with me on this, is this movie Cold Turkey. Have you ever seen Cold Turkey?
No.
Okay.
No.
It's a comedy, and it's from 1972, I believe, and it was directed by Norman Lear. And I think he wrote it, and with his partner Bud Yorkin at that time. It's a comedy movie that is about an entire town that tries to quit smoking for a month to win this huge prize. And it has Dick Van Dyke. It has a whole bunch of comedians. It's a Mad World is probably another movie that I love in that vein. This is very much like that, but kind of a lower budget thing. And every single time it comes on, I have to watch it. Mad World too, but Mad World, there's long, very slow parts in it.
Yeah, that movie's like 4 hours long.
I know. There's certainly parts that I love. Like I could watch the part with Jim Backus over and over. The part where Jonathan Winters demolishes the gas station where Arnold Stang and Marvin Kaplan. That stuff, I can watch those over and over. But in terms of a movie that I want to see every time, and this movie also aired on TV when I was a teenager over and over and over. So if you like comedies in that vein, the vein of Mad World, and with a great assortment of 70s TV stars, check out Cold Turkey. You won't have any trouble finding it.
Well, the other thing I wanted to chat with you a little bit about was that we know from listening to the commentaries that Mad Magazine was like a huge influence on the writers. And part of the premise of the show came about with this idea is that like for our generation, Nate and my generation, we were born in the early 80s. So like right as The Simpsons started. The Simpsons was kind of our generation's Mad Magazine. Like it introduced us to pop culture and, references that we would have no reference point to otherwise. were movie parodies a big influence on you as a kid? And certainly Mad Magazine was an influence for you?
Oh, my God. Mad Magazine, yes. And again, this is another thing where it requires context for people who are younger. There wasn't anything to watch or do when you were a kid. Like, you don't, like, now you got cable TV, you got Nickelodeon, you have whatever, and you have a million things on the internet all day long. Prior to 1995, I'd say, there wasn't that much for kids to do. Like, you'd watch cartoons on Saturday morning, and then if you're lucky, you'd have a channel where cartoons would come on in the afternoon, maybe, and there'd be a TV show on prime time like the Brady Bunch that you might like. And that's it. And then Mad only came out once every 8 weeks. And it was amazing. You get Mad, and you sit there and you'd read it, and you'd be like, oh my God, you'd read every little bit of it. And then it'd be 8 weeks till it came out again, and it would be agonizing. You know, you'd have to go find Cracked. If you were lucky, you find Cracked, which is a huge disappointment every time.
Yeah.
And then other than that, like we had Archie and that kind of thing. And so, to be honest, yes, everybody who was a kid of a certain type between 1955 and 1975, Mad was extremely formative in their growing up, especially for people who on The Simpsons. Now, in this case, what we're going to talk about, I would say it's actually more informed by Archie and Archie's Gag Bag and things like that. Which, again, Archie would not have been my first choice, but after the issue of Mad had been read, Archie had all these digests because they had such a backlog of stuff. You get Archie Digest that had 150 pages of cartoons, and it would be like, there's some stories, but there's a lot of things that are one-page gags, like Archie's Gag Bag, literally called that. It's a one-joke thing with Jughead, or a one-joke thing with Big Moose. And that is where this whole thing came from.
When you were reading like Mad as a kid, would you have like known some of the movies that they were parodying, or would that be your first introduction?
No, I didn't like that movie parodies. In general, I did not know the movies. The thing about Mad is that they were writing for a fairly grown-up audience who had seen movies like A Clockwork Orange. That was the first issue of Mad that I ever got, was Clockwork Orange.
Wow.
And I was like, that's an X-rated movie. That was X back when X was for serious adult movies. I think the first movie I ever saw was around that time that they parodied was the Poseidon Adventure.
Right.
And that was exciting because I was like, I know this movie for once. And it's not some movie, the obscure grown-up movie with Barbara Streisand that I've never heard of. I mean, their movie parodies often were the part where I just kind of skimmed those because I didn't know what was going on.
Interesting.
And it would be a rare time when I'd seen the movie. Also, kids didn't get to go to the movies very much. I should say I live out in the country. I maybe saw 2 movies in a theater before I was 12.
Oh, wow.
Maybe. The whole kids' movies in the theaters thing didn't exist. Disney would come out with a movie like The Fox and the Hounds or whatever, or something of that nature once every couple of years, and that was the only chance you got to go to the movie theater.
Wow. Well, it's interesting because you said Cold Turkey was a movie you watched a lot on TV as a kid. And as we've been sort of going through this show and looking at the movies that we're covering, it seems like a lot of these were sort of like, you know, Saturday Night at the Movies, or we're Canadian, so we had different names for it, but they seem like a lot of movies that were played on TV, like a lot, like Planet of the Apes, and would that have influenced the writers in terms of the types of movies that you guys were parodying? Was the fact that they were just movies that you had seen like 1,000 times growing up?
Oh, for sure, yes, because you know, especially if you're staying up late, and also they had afternoon movies. Again, if you didn't want to stop watching TV at around 2:30 after the soap operas were over, most TV stations would have the afternoon movie.
Okay.
And it would be some old movie. Sometimes they'd be horror movies or thrillers or comedies that were in the vein of Cold Turkey. So that's sometimes where you'd see them. Or if you got to stay up late, that was all they played, late at night on some channels, was old movies.
Right. And the irony being that for our generation growing up, The Simpsons became the sort of like the filler that was on.
That's
like,
right.
Yeah. Nate and I were saying, in the sort of like our heyday in Canada, you basically, I think, what was it, from like 3 o'clock until 7 o'clock, you could find
8 o'clock or 9 o'clock.
Yeah, you could find back-to-back episodes of The Simpsons, so you could just watch The Simpsons in reruns for several hours, which is
oh my god,
why
I would
we
never
all
have
became...
gone outside. I would never.
No, we literally we did it.
If I was a kid in that era.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's exactly what it was like. So it was the same thing where it was sort of like we were quoting The Simpsons constantly because we were watching The Simpsons constantly. We would have seen the same episodes again and again and again and again and again. Sometimes I feel like even in the same week, you'd see the same episode again. So I'm a huge nerd. And over the past year or so, I've been kind of collecting this giant database of every Simpsons movie reference for the first 13 seasons. And, like that's out there on the internet, but I tried to do it in a way so I could actually get statistics about like what kinds of movies are being parodied and that kind of thing. And one of the things that I was able to piece together is just like how many references there are in different seasons of The Simpsons. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I noticed is that during your time as showrunner, there are actually fewer movie references overall than, say, in like season 5 and 6 or season 3 and 4. And I was curious, like, did you know that? And was that sort of a conscious decision, or is it maybe more just a reflection of your and Josh's interests or philosophy?
Now that you say it, that sounds reasonable. Because I believe at the time we were like, well, everybody, we've already done that. All the big things had already been done. We've done all the Citizen Kane, done Citizen Kane 5-6 times, Godfather 5-6 times, Goodfellas, all those ones that people knew had already been done. So we generally didn't try to force in movie references unless they were very organic to the story. And I would say most of the ones that were the big movie references, you know, when you've Gone with the Wind or whatever, that kind of thing had already been done by that time.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I feel like listening to the commentary too, it seems like a lot of the episodes that come to mind, it seems like you're sort of encouraging the writers to also draw a lot from their personal experience, from their childhood and that kind of thing, rather than from like a really pop culture sort of angle. Does that seem right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, actually, this is a perfect segue to let's talk about the episode in particular. Like, this is the 30th anniversary of Pulp Fiction, so we thought this was a great excuse to go back and revisit one of Nate and my favorite episodes, which is 22 short films about Springfield. But we have a very unique sort of way of coming to this episode in a weird way, and it formulating as our favorite episode. So we've been friends for basically over 20 years, whatever. We're, you know, in our mid to late 30s. And in high school, we worked together and we made a bunch of short films. And so we were making one weekend, and I was staying over at Nate's house, and I just threw some Simpson DVDs in my bag. And the one that happened to be thrown in was season 7. We're throwing it on and watching it periodically in between like setups and staying up late and all this stuff. And for whatever reason, when 22 short films came on, we were all paying attention, and we just ended up quoting it like for the rest of the weekend. So we have all this behind the scenes footage of us saying things like, you know, donuts, I've got hey, I know you. And like, and we love, like, for whatever reason, the sequence that, you know, really stuck out to us that we kept quoting was the very tall man sequence where he is like making fun of Nelson and all that. So,
and steamed hams, of course, but I feel like we had been repeating it so much that just Skinner saying yes became the sort of shorthand for the whole scene.
Oh, yeah.
I would be like, hey, Nate, does this shot look okay? He would just respond, yes. And we would immediately burst into laughter. So it very much went off the rails, but we did manage to finish the film eventually. But I was rewatching with the commentary this morning, and you talked about how there was the episode that came in short, and so they had the little everyone loves Ned Flanders, and you guys love that, and you're like, oh, I wish we could do that more. But your episodes always tended to come in long. And ironically, that you said the first draft of 22 short films came in at about 65 pages, and you needed to get it down to like 44. So I'm just curious, is there a specific segment that was dropped that stands out in your mind that you wish you hadn't, or any memories of what didn't make the sort of final quote unquote 22 short films, even though we know that it's actually not 22?
There's a few. I mean, I don't want to repeat everything you heard in the commentary because that covers this in great detail, but that is exactly what happened. And we decided we were going to do a whole episode of Archie's Gag Bag things. And we had a football style draft where all the writers got to pick their favorite characters. And I believe I forced my way into being number 1 since I was running the show, Josh. And I said, I'm doing Skinner and Chalmers. They're taken. Everyone else can take all the leftovers. So then we went around the room and everybody said, okay, I'm going to take Ralph Wiggum. I'll take Krusty. I'll take Marge. Whatever. And so every writer, I think, ended up with 3. We said they can be short, they can be half a page, they can be 4 pages. And so I think the script, I was a lot longer than 65 pages. I mean, I think it was more like 90 pages when it came in because we knew that a lot of these things were going to fall by the wayside because that was the assembled, you know, we had Greg Daniels at that point was going to assemble them all in some sort of logical order and or rewrite them if necessary. But, you know, the writers all turned in their drafts for the characters they had chosen. And then Greg assembled them into a giant, you know, thing. And then we decided we're going to cut this one, we're going to cut that one. And then we kept cutting them until it got down to the proper length. And also Greg kept refining it so that it sort of all took place in one day. And there was a logical sequence of events. The ones that I remember that got, well, and you can find all these online. There was a fantastic, very complicated one with Mole Man that Ken Keeler wrote. There was like Mole Man's Incredible Day. And it was like, it's very funny. You can find it. I know it was posted on Twitter a couple years ago. And it was very long, too. It was probably about as long as the Steamed Hams one.
Oh,
and
wow,
it was an
okay.
enormous, complicated adventure that Mole Man had in his drab, dreary life. I won't spoil it for people who want to read it. And then there were ones that were animated. Like there was one. These are on the DVD and the deleted scenes. There was one with Krusty and Ralph Wiggum on a plane together, and I think there was another one or two. But basically, it was a slow process of attrition, having to trim things that we loved to get it down to time, which is always what happened with these episodes, but more so with this episode than any other one.
Wow. Actually piecing this together into an episode must have been a huge process. When did Pulp Fiction come into the mix? Was it a kind of an early idea, or was it something that came together through that, like, stitching together?
I think it might have come about halfway. The movie might have actually come out when we were doing this. I'm not totally sure, but this whole thing was not inspired by Pulp Fiction. It was inspired by, let's do an entire Archie's Digest full of gag bags and stitch them together in some logical way. And I don't remember when Pulp Fiction came out, but as I said, it might have been around the time that we were doing this. And then we were like, well, that seems like a natural thing to pay tribute to, because it is a story told in multiple parts, and it's all sorts of little vignettes and so forth pieced together. So it became very clear right away, and I don't remember at what point in the process, that there was going to be a little bit of Pulp Fiction homage in this.
Got it. Cool. And yeah, do you recall who drew the lot for Snake or Wiggum?
I do not know who wrote that stuff. It might have been Greg. I don't remember. I don't even know if that was one that was in the draft. Generally, it might have been. Might have been Greg piecing it together later, and we were like, we need a Pulp Fiction style thing to wrap this all up. And if somebody did write it, it was probably Brent Forrester. Thinking back about it.
So I'd love to ask you about Pulp Fiction a little bit, just because, again, it's the 30th anniversary and it is associated with this episode. Whenever we do these shows, we always like to ask our guests to sum the movie we watched up in a sentence. I don't know the last time you watched Pulp Fiction, but do you think you could give a one-sentence summary of the movie?
Yeah. I mean, it's, three intertwining stories tell an eventful day in the life of some Los Angeles lowlives.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
That is exactly
nails it.
I would say that nails it. Yeah. What's your history with the movie? You mentioned that you're a big Tarantino fan. Do you remember? Because this is the thing. Is like Nate and I in 1994, which is when I think the movie came out. We would have been bad at math, 6. So we didn't see this movie obviously when it came out. And our understanding is that it kind of changed the way movies looked and sounded for the next sort of decade. Do you have any memories of seeing the movie for the first time and like what the reaction to this movie was like?
Yes, I do. Well, first of all, I wasn't a Tarantino fan until this movie because he'd only made one other movie, as if I recall correctly, which was Reservoir Dogs, which I don't think I had seen. I don't know that anybody in The Simpsons had seen it other than Dan McGrath, who was talking about it frequently, but it was still kind of an art house type movie at that point. So I remember when Pulp Fiction came out, I distinctly remember seeing it in the theater at Hastings Ranch in Pasadena, California, in a big theater. I remember it being extremely exciting because it was not your usual movie. I think the only movie that had that kind of effect on an audience and on me prior to that was Goodfellas. And Goodfellas was not nearly so experimental as Pulp Fiction was, but it did have moments of like, wow, that's a cool sequence, man. Listen to the music and the way that came together. And Pulp Fiction took that and then mixed it all up by telling the stories in kind of backwards orders in some way. And it had a number of incredibly cool scenes that you didn't see in movies like that nobody had seen in movies like them, the Batusi dance and that kind of thing. And I remember thinking it was incredible. And I think the audience also agreed. I remember hearing about the way that nobody wanted to make that movie. Danny DeVito or whatever from Jersey Hills had to beg, literally on his knees, to beg the studio to finance it or whatever. And it's like, that's the story of Hollywood. Often the things that are the hardest sell that nobody wants to make, those are the things that define a whole new genre. And now, I mean, since then, yes, as you said, it wasn't just for a year. It's been continuously since then. 5 to 10% of all movies are that style now, including everything that Guy Ritchie has ever done, including that new thing he has on Netflix, is another one of these things. And I'm sure Guy Ritchie considers himself to have made up that style, but in reality, it didn't exist until after Tarantino had developed it.
Right.
Yeah, totally. I feel like this is a perfect example of the premise of this series, which is just that we were very much introduced to Pulp Fiction through this episode of The Simpsons. I'd never seen the movie, and then I can remember when I finally watched it, I think I kind of knew that the stuff with Snake and Wiggum was a parody of that movie, but I didn't know the whole Royale with cheese stuff was also a parody. So that was like an aha moment where I was like, that was on The Simpsons. I get it now.
It's just somewhat of a parallel to The Simpsons, which I think you got to have it be a historian to understand. But when The Simpsons came on TV, there wasn't stuff like that on TV. You know, it was The Cosby Show, Is Mad About You. It was things like that. The Simpsons was an animated show, hadn't been an animated show on prime time for 30 years, and there certainly hadn't been one with this kind of attitude, which I guess I would best describe as a late night attitude, a SNL type attitude brought to prime time. And that was revolutionary at the time. This movie was the same thing. If you look at the movie universe of 1993, you're not seeing a lot of, maybe in the art house, but you're seeing Romancing the Stone, you're seeing things like that, and just the kind of regular old Hollywood movies that they don't make that much anymore. This movie was a mind blower to many in the audience, including me.
I mean, I actually feel like I see a lot of connection between Tarantino and The Simpsons, both in terms of just changing the format, changing the conversation completely, and then having a whole bunch of imitators. But then also, I feel like just the way that it's engaging with pop culture and kind of bringing that in. And both have so many footnotes, which is like what gets me really excited too.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, does that make sense to you? It feels like there's connection there.
That's perfectly well said, yes. Both The Simpsons and many of the works of Tarantino are steeped in pop culture to the point that it's wallpaper, and people, you assume that people know it. If they don't know it, they think it's kind of cool, and maybe they look it up. It assumes a certain cultural knowledge on the part of the viewer just to even buy in. And then for people who don't know that stuff, there's an interesting story. It's kind of cool. But for those who do, it's like, oh my God, this is great. We're steeped in this whole world of interesting stuff that other people don't seem to know about, or at least they didn't.
Well, and that is sort of the premise of our show, is just like getting the chance to go back and revisit the stuff that we know we were taught by The Simpsons, like a Pulp Fiction, but also discovering these new things. Like, I now want to check out Cold Turkey, or this season we also went and checked out What's Up, Doc, a movie which I was vaguely aware of, but didn't really know. And then watching it, I'm like, oh my God, this unlocks so many things for me.
Yeah.
And Radio Bart is apparently partly inspired by like an old Billy Wilder movie, and so we're like,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's I think it's called Ace in the Hole.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right.
It's one of
no idea.
Yeah, it's one of Spike Lee's favorite movies. I've heard him reference this a bunch of times, and then I was like reading the plot, and I was like, this kind of sounds familiar. And then I was like, oh my God, like the Radio Bart is clearly riffing on that. But again, I think that's what makes the show infinitely rewatchable, is that as you get older, you've unlocked more of the sort of references, and you get to go, hey, I get what that was now. But the show is still incredibly original.
And I shall say, we always were doing that because there's a lot of great stories in old movies, in old literature and things that can be retold within the Simpsons framework. In fact, we would also tell people, watch old episodes of Leave It to Beaver and then think, how would the Simpsons do that? It's a story about a kid who shoplifts and then he feels guilty. I mean, there's a Simpsons approach to that.
Yep. Yeah.
And so that's one of the things we would often do. And I'll tell you, possibly the most hated episode we ever worked on, that's what it was. That one with Skinner, Armin Tamzarian, that's a story that goes back to the 1500s. It's the return of Martin Guerre, one of the very first big popular stories in fiction. And it was an Oscar-winning movie in like 1980. And then it was remade as a movie, Summersby, with Richard Gere. And we were like, this is a story that fits Skinner perfectly. And everybody who'd never heard that story was like, this is awful, you ruined the show. We're like, we're just doing the return of Martin Guerre with Prince Skinner. And anyway, but yeah, we won't. That's another episode.
But I love that episode, and like
me too.
And maybe part of it is coming at it from a very different viewpoint and understanding that like I'm watching it on DVD and I know the show is going to be fine. You're not breaking the entire continuity. But I think that's what I love the most about the seasons that you and Josh ran, is that you were keeping it within the Simpsons context and what we came to know and love, but also, as you said, you didn't want to repeat yourselves, and you wanted to try new things, and you wanted to explore the characters that maybe haven't been explored enough, and taking it away from just the core family members. When we were doing the research, we read that there was talk for a while of maybe doing a spin-off show where it was kind of like 22 short films, where you would just every week you would explore a side character. And I was like, that would have been great.
Like well, I'll tell you what happened with that. I think this was like the year 2004, maybe 2005. Josh and I were with Matt Groening. We got along with him quite well back in those days. We had similar sensibilities. And we were like, let's do a spinoff. We both agreed that is very much inspired by 22 short films. One episode will be about Homer when he's 12, you know?
Right.
So there'll be things, all sorts of things that take from the Simpsons universe but are things that they would not do on the regular show.
Right.
Of course, what people don't realize is that Matt Groening does not control the show. Brooks controls it. James Brooks.
Oh.
James L. Brooks makes all the decisions about the show because he's the owner of the show. Matt is the employee, a well-compensated employee, creator. But so anything has to be involving the show, it has to go through Brooks. Brooks had not seen 22 short films. They sent him a tape of it, and that was the last we ever heard because he apparently hated it.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, and I
that's too
understand
bad.
his perspective is that he likes stories with the family. You can understand what his thinking is in that vein. 22 Short Films is a episode for Simpsons nerds, and Jim Brooks is not a Simpsons nerd. He's a guy who probably created many of the things that are the framework of the show, the heart and things like that. He didn't want to do a masturbatory series for Simpsons nerds like we did.
Right. Which,
that makes sense.
as you say, makes sense knowing his sort of background and how he rooted the early seasons of the show in that sort of like, don't treat it like it's just a
live-action
cartoon.
sitcom.
Yeah, which is brilliant. But at the same time, to me, the show becomes so like metatextual and so referential that having a spin-off show like that really does kind of fit within that world.
Well, I'll tell you what's happened is that the fans have made it themselves. Over the past 7 to 10 years, all the stuff that we would ever have done has been done by fans on YouTube and so forth. People have made their own animated versions of everything or comics or whatever. And so that's what happened is that it ended up, he didn't have any control over it. It was all made by fans for no money. But that's where that stuff has ended up.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. It seems like, as well, your seasons, and particularly this episode, are also some of the raw material for that online explosion of fan content.
It seems like that. This was a show for Simpsons fans. Like, the thing about this is, I think I said this in the commentary, this did not have a good table read. The table read was an interesting experience every week because 12 writers, we write the script, we have a very different perspective on the show than the people who attend the table reads. There's 80 people that attend the table reads from all different stripes who work on the show in tangential ways. So at those table reads, you get to hear what perhaps a more layman's perspective on the episodes are. The episodes that would do well, table reads were always the emotional ones, Lisa ones with a very clear emotional story. This episode did not have that. It was a fragmented series of sketches, and the episode had a bad table read, and fortunately, Josh and I were in a position to say, we don't care. This is going on the air the way we like it. Which we also had to do with other episodes, too.
Right.
But that was a privilege of that particular time and place that we got to make those kind of calls.
And thank God you did. I mean, in the episode or the commentary, you don't reveal, and you don't have to reveal it here, or we can edit it out. But that, like, even some of the cast were like, "What the is this? Like, I don't want to do this."
I would say it wasn't like there was a revolution. It was more like a lack of enthusiasm. There was a revolution. Basically, I think from what I heard, there was one at the baseball episode back in that was before my time.
Which we covered last season.
There was, and I know in the George Bush episode, Harry Shearer was as close as he ever got to furious about having to do those. He didn't like that episode at all. I think he wanted it to be more political in some incisive way. And we were like, no, this is a Dennis the Menace parody. But yes, it just suffered from a lack of enthusiasm from the cast. But we were also, I think we were convinced, we saw this episode in our heads, and we knew that eventually it was going to come out well. It's not something you can track easily when you're reading it on paper, but if you see it as, especially given the success of Pulp Fiction, I think that buoyed our confidence that it was going to come out well.
That actually sort of is a nice segue to a question that I was hoping to ask sort of near the end, but it fits in nicely here, is just sort of like about the long tail that your years as a showrunner has had. You know, we became obsessed with this when the show was on DVD, which sort of predates all the internet memery around steamed hams and various other things. But I'm just curious, the sort of cultural impact that your years running the show has sort of had. When did that sort of click with you and Josh? When did you realize within this very special thing, we've maybe made something that's special in a different way and has created this massive fan base?
I don't think it was till about 2007, about 10 years after we left the show. A lot had to do with the rising tide of the internet as well. Because you would hear stuff like, we didn't hear stuff again, I don't want to sound like it's antique, but
No.
there was no Twitter then. There was the only thing we had was alt.tv.simpsons, which was on Usenet back then, and those guys hated everything. It started in season 3. They were like, "This is the worst episode ever," which is where we got that. Obviously,
of course,
the show's falling apart. It's terrible. This episode of Radio Bart's the worst thing in the world. This episode of the Itchy and Scratchy is the worst thing I've ever seen. It's terrible. They don't know what they're doing, and that was when we had our modem disconnected, and we were like, "We don't need to read this anymore. It's too depressing." And you also, critics didn't write about shows that were already on the air generally.
Right.
I remember the only time that any critic ever wrote anything about the show during the time was Entertainment Weekly wrote a thing and basically gave our seasons or one of our seasons an A. And we're like, okay, that's good. That's an exciting development because that doesn't usually happen. And certainly, why would they devote their main review to a show that's already been on for 7 years? That was exciting. But then it all drifted away, and we didn't start hearing about it until I remember there was an article in Slate or Salon or something like that came around in 2007, and I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting that they think our seasons were so good. And then after that, we began to have a slow internet avalanche of stuff where it seemed like a lot of the stuff that people were quoting and memeing and stuff was stuff from our seasons, culminating with the whole Steamed Hams thing starting in about 2014. And I will tell you why I think this may be, because I've developed a theory about this over time. Josh and I were huge Simpsons fans when we got hired. Like, you couldn't watch old episodes of The Simpsons on TV at this time, you know?
Right.
So during our lunch breaks, we would go down to their vault. They had a vault with like all the episodes on 3/4-inch videotape, and we'd be like, let's watch Separate Vocations. Let's watch, Homer the Heretic or whatever on our lunch break. And so we watched old Simpsons episodes for fun during our lunch break, and that was back when nobody could see old Simpsons episodes.
Wow.
So we were Simpsons fans when we got hired, and we were like, this thing is an incredible sandbox we've been given the keys to, so we are going to indulge ourselves. Also because, as I've said repeatedly, we were certain the show was going to be over within a year or two because sitcoms didn't last. MASH lasted 9 seasons. Cheers lasted 10 seasons. We were on season 8. We're like, this thing is running out of gas. We are going to have as much fun as we possibly can. So we were writing episodes for ourselves who were Simpsons fans. I'm sure that both Fox and probably Brooks wished that someone else were running the show during those years because our ratings were not that high. We were always beat by Mad About You. We were like the 60th most popular show on TV every week. And we were just in the fortunate position of saying, we're writing this for ourselves, to entertain ourselves and Simpsons fans, and we're huge Simpsons fans. So I think what happened is there was a lot more subtle fan service in those seasons than there were in other seasons that people who grew up watching The Simpsons appreciate as they've gotten older.
That's really interesting. I would never have thought to use that term fan service for some of those seasons, but that makes sense. It's like there's some deeper cuts, right? All of the side characters get a spotlight on them. All the characters but like you didn't get a lot of in the earlier seasons.
I think may have something to do with it. I mean, it's certainly in episodes like 22 Short Films or the spin-off one, that's fan service, man. That's just, again, it's masturbatory self-indulgence with the sandbox of keys to the kingdom that we had been given.
But also the Armin Tamzarian episode is, maybe it's the opposite of fan service in the sense that you outraged a lot of fans.
Yeah, no, that's the opposite of fan service.
But it shows a sort of a very different approach that you guys are taking where you're saying we're not afraid to quote unquote break the show because, as you said, it's running out of gas. We
did that. People liked it when Milhouse got divorced. I mean, Milhouse wasn't an important character. But when Milhouse's parents got divorced, there was a debate, I recall, about like, well, they got to get back together at the end of the episode. And I think we were like, no, they don't. They could be divorced forever. And so that's what happened with Principal Skinner. Also, by the way, for that episode, there was other stuff that would have made it more palatable that we have ended up cutting, some from Ken's script and some, I think if we had just said at the end, this was an episode of Simpsons Fantasy Theater, none of this really happened, people would not have had the problem that they did with it.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I mean, that kind of reminds me for this episode, it's like one of the few that actually has the title on screen, right? 22 short films about Springfield to kind of, on the commentary, I think you say to kind of set people's expectations of like what's going to happen.
That's what Pulp Fiction did too, I think. We took that from them. And also the title from 32 short films about Glenn Gould, which none of us had ever seen, but we thought that was a cool title.
So we actually just covered that on this podcast. And I mean, again, Adam said we're both Canadian, so we were kind of like, oh, it's like this Canadian movie. And so we dug into that. But I'm curious, have you ever seen it since?
No.
I know you said, no. Fair enough.
You don't need to. Artsy. It's fine.
Yeah, it's also probably the most Canadian thing I've ever seen.
It sounded cool. Oh, cool. Okay, well, maybe I should see it then.
I mean, if you're a big Glenn Gould fan, maybe it's worth checking out, but our takeaway from it is it's a very unique way of approaching a biopic because it is just a series of short films, which for a certain kind of musician could maybe work really well. But if you don't know Glenn Gould, which despite us being Canadian and him being a Canadian, icon, we're not like super deep on him. It left a lot of sort of like dots and lines we had to fill in. So
and some of the short films are literally like waveforms of music or like abstract circles moving around the screen.
Yeah.
Like it's pretty out there.
It's pretty weird.
Well, we're kind of coming up on time, but I do have like one thing that I would love to try out if you're a game. So basically, when you go online and you look up Simpsons episodes on like IMDb or Wikipedia, there's always like lots of claims about like what's being parodied, what movie is being referenced. And some of them are kind of hard to figure out, right? Like whether it is or it isn't. So I'm curious if you'd be game to do sort of a lightning round of a few episodes that you wrote, and we'll see if we can suss some of these out. So, all right. So feel free to say yes, no, pass. And if you have any like details you want to add, feel free to add that as well. So season 4's Marge in Chains. Is the scene where Otto is attacked by the flu cloud while suntanning on a roof a reference to Q the Winged Serpent?
Not that I know of. It's quite possible. Sometimes I should say maybe the animators made it a reference to that,
right,
unbeknownst to us.
Okay.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and so some of these might definitely.
Or Mike and Al, Mike and Al were running the show at that time, so it's quite possible they requested that, but it doesn't sound like it to me.
Fair enough. All right. Season 5's Springfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling. Homer mentions a time when he allowed an escaped lunatic into the house because he was dressed like Santa Claus. Is this a reference to Christmas Evil?
I think it must be. I mean, it was not a conscious reference to that, but I know that we'd heard about it. I didn't put that in. That was from the writer's room, and I'm sure it just was in the ether, yes.
Awesome. Season 5's Lady Bouvier's Lover. This is a weird one. I've always been curious about this sequence. Homer gives Grandpa this like musical advice in that scene, and I was always wondered if it was a reference to Cool from West Side Story, where he's telling him he has to be cool.
No, it's a reference to cartoons, those weird kind of jazz cartoons from like the 50s. Like I think the animators should have taken it a couple of steps further, but I think the Disney once did a jazz one, and I know that there were a couple other ones that were kind of abstract freeform jazz cartoons in that era of those kind of like extremely artsy cartoons in the 50s. The thing is, both the music and the art were not quite what we had in mind when we wrote it.
Fascinating. I love that. We just uncovered that. I would never, ever have made that connection. And then lastly, all right, season 6's Bart versus Australia. The final scene with the bullfrog infestation. Is that a reference to the movie Frogs?
No. Not that I know of. It was not intended to be that.
Awesome.
Okay. I hope that answered your question.
No, that was perfect. We've never tried that on the show before, but that was kind of fun. And I love that reference from Lady Bouvier's Lover. I'm going to look that up.
Before we let you go, Bill, when we talk about these movies and episodes, we like to sort of add our final verdict. So I know we didn't talk too much about Pulp Fiction, but it sounds like I also know how you're going to answer this. But at the end of the day, would you recommend this movie to our listeners who maybe haven't seen it before?
Oh my God, yes. It's fantastic. For sure. I mean, it's an incredibly entertaining movie. I think I must have seen it 2 years ago. It holds up. It's got a lot of really exciting, memorable sequences that if you've never seen this movie, you have to see it. It helps to remember this invented that type of movie.
Right.
If you've seen a lot of other things that imitate this style, you might think it's kind of corny in a way, but in fact, it was the pioneer of this type of stuff.
Is there anything that you would maybe recommend if you were going to do like a double feature? Is there another movie that you think pairs really well with it?
Well, I would suggest that you watch one of Guy Ritchie's early films to go with it. And to then see kind of what, like, it'll give you a similar vibe. I don't remember what that was. Snatch was one of them.
Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels is the one from
Snatch.
Before Snatch.
Either one of those. And then you see kind of how that style was adapted by Guy Ritchie. And they're both very entertaining stories as well.
Yeah. That's also great. High school favorites for us.
Yeah.
They were very much defining moments in our sort of tastes at that time. Because when we were growing up, those were more contemporary than Pulp Fiction. It was like a little bit older. So you're right, though. I think we probably gave Guy Ritchie a little more credit than he was maybe due because
he adapted it into his own style, which is very entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally.
Bill, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an immense pleasure
thank you.
Chatting with you and learning more about the process and the history and, how all this stuff that we love gets made.
It's been a total pleasure, guys. And thank you for allowing me to go deep down into those incredibly deep, reflective dives that I don't normally get to do it with anyone else. So thank you.
And I'm definitely going to try and track down Cold Turkey because we might have to put that into another season.
You will be able to find it in 10 seconds on Amazon or probably streaming for free on Tubi or something like that. And you got to have an affection for that era, people such as Dick Van Dyke and Gene Stapleton and things like that. But if you do, I think you'll find that it has kind of a Mad, Mad World vibe. It makes me laugh. There's a number of things that Josh and I have quoted for years from that movie that still make me laugh. And sequences that when I think of them make me laugh too. You'll get a kick out of it, I think. Well, I won't spoil the ending for you, but there's also something that when you see it, you will know that I really enjoyed.
Okay. Interesting. Actually, before I let you go, I would just love to ask too, because, again, being the movie podcast for Simpsons fans, are there any other films that you remember when you were working on the show or Mad Mad World we know is because we talked to Michael Price and he referenced that. What's Up, Doc? I said sort of unlocked a lot of. Is there some Animal House you mentioned is one of your favorites,
sure.
and I know that that's a huge influence on the show. Are there anything else that we should maybe look into as being not necessarily there was a direct reference on the show, but really opened up or was a major player for the writers of your era?
I would say Dazed and Confused. Dazed and Confused came out towards the time that we were leaving that thing, and I found Josh and I found it very inspiring for our subsequent projects.
Interesting.
But
okay.
that was the movie that came out during the time that we were there, other than Pulp Fiction, that I remember thinking, I love this movie so much. We wrote him a letter. In fact, I think I wrote him a letter on Simpsons Stationery, Richard Linklater, complimenting him on the movie, but I never mailed it for whatever reason because I just thought it was so incredibly good. And it's because it was obviously American Graffiti. That's the other one. American Graffiti is the movie that Linklater acknowledges that he's basically ripping off in Dazed and Confused. Both of them are two of my favorite movies of all time for sure.
Yeah, I feel like you can even see some of the DNA of that in this episode as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
It's possible. It's another set of intertwining stories all take place in one day, yeah. American Graffiti, by the way, that sequence is in Summer of Forfeit 2. When he goes to buy that stuff at the convenience store, I'm sure you guys already covered that. You know it. The whole when he tries to buy the condoms and all that stuff, and Marge says, I don't know what you've got in mind, but count me out. That's directly lifted from American Graffiti, as is some other parts of that episode. So, okay, I won't belabor it any longer. Great talking to you guys. Thank you for having me on. It was a total pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure. So if you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review and share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. It makes a huge difference. I think this one's going to be a little easier to share because, we do have a legendary Simpsons writer. So hopefully that will pique some interest in people. But we do appreciate it if you could give us a like and a follow and a share and a subscribe and hit the star and all that good stuff. So in the meantime, until next time, Nate,
We'll see you around the Plex.
we'll see you around the Plex.